Good Thursday morning. It's September 23rd, 2021. I'm Guy McPherson of Nature Bats Last. You can find Nature Bats Last at GuyMcPherson.com. And I recommend you go to GuyMcPherson.com upon release of this video and find the peer-reviewed paper to which I will refer. Only one paper this time around. It's called The Myth of the 1970s Global Cooling Scientific Consensus. It's written by Thomas Peterson and two other authors and published September 1st, 2008. Usually on these science updates, we update you on the science with breaking news, with something that has only come out quite recently. This time I go all the way back to a paper from 2008 because there seems to be considerable confusion about what happened in the 1970s with respect to climate science. The title tells the story, The Myth of the 1970s Global Cooling Scientific Consensus. Here's the subhead. There was no scientific consensus in the 1970s that the Earth was headed into an imminent ice age. Indeed, the possibility of anthropogenic warming dominated the peer-reviewed literature even then. The paper goes on at some length to point out that we have been in a warming period since we began burning fossil fuels in, well, at least by 1750, and probably for a couple of hundred years before that. We use 1750 as the baseline, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because that's when, at the world scale, we begin burning a heck of a lot of fossil fuels, most notably in the beginning coal, and then more recently oil and natural gas. I'm going to read just a couple of snippets from this paper, The Myth of the 1970s Global Cooling Scientific Consensus, by Peterson and two other colleagues. Here's one to start with. Despite active efforts to answer these questions, this refers to the lead paragraph in this peer-reviewed paper, the following pervasive myth arose. There was a consensus among climate scientists in the 1970s that either global cooling or a full-fledged ice age was imminent. A review of the climate science literature from 1965 to 1979 shows this myth to be false. Shows this myth to be false. This is a myth. That's why it's false. There was no global cooling going on in the 1970s. Indeed, in 1965, when United States President Lyndon Baines Johnson asked the members of his President's Science Advisory Committee to report on the potential problems of environmental pollution, climate change was not on the national agenda. It was all about pollution. It was all about detergents and municipal sewage, chronic problems associated with urban air pollution, and the risks associated with pesticides. That's what dominated the public discourse. We knew very little about climate change at the time. In fact, the interdisciplinary activity known as climate change wasn't even recognized as a thing. There was no climate scientists. There were a bunch of geologists, a bunch of atmospheric scientists, and a bunch of biologists who were studying various aspects of climate change. But it was basically, as pointed out in this paper, the blind men trying to feel the elephant. And everybody was feeling a different part of the elephant. It was difficult to come up with any sort of consensus on what was going on. Still, there was absolutely no consensus that there was any global cooling going on in the 1970s. That was evident. This paper goes on. The 23-page appendix to this national report, which today appears prescient, the committee's environmental pollution panel laid out the following stark scenario. Emissions of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels could rapidly reshape Earth's climate. Rapidly being a key word in that phrase. The bottom line from this paper, published in 2008, about the myth of global cooling, is this. This is the final sentence of the paper. Clearly, if a national report in the 1970s advocates urgent action to address global warming, then the scientific consensus of the 1970s was not global cooling. There's no such animal as global cooling going on in the 1970s or since then. It's a myth. It's a myth perpetrated and perpetuated by members of the fossil fuel lobby and other people who are trying to confuse the masses. After all, that's a primary goal of the corporate media, is to confuse the masses. It's working. Let it not work on you. We're not in the midst of cooling. We have, since 1750, we have not been in the midst of any sort of cooling cycle that lasted for more than a decade or two. And this continued perpetuation of the 1970s cooling myth is absolute nonsense. Thank you for your attention. We'll try to produce another one of these science updates within the next week or so. Maybe it'll even be on a paper that's, newer than a dozen years or so.